This week, we're speaking with an international thought leader, and he has some viewpoints with regard to climate change and wars and geopolitics and the impact on your portfolio and how you make better wealth decisions. You're not going to want to miss this week.
This is Make Better Wealth Decisions, a podcast dedicated to helping pre-retirees and retirees manage risk and economic uncertainty by adopting a pension-style approach to improve your risk-return trade-off. I'm your host, John DeGuy, the portfolio manager with Design Securities in Toronto.
This week, we're speaking to Akaash Maharaj. He has degrees from Sorbonne and Oxford, and he's a widely respected international thought leader. He's had a variety of career stops that includes being the CEO of Equestrian Canada, the CEO of the Global Organization of Parliamentarians Against Corruption, the CEO of the Mosaic Institute, a senior fellow at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, and more recently and currently, Akaash serves as the Director of Policy for Nature Canada. How are you?
I'm well. How are you, John?
I'm great. I'm delighted to be able to have you on the podcast, Akaash, because I've been a fan of yours for a very long time. And you really do have a wonderful resume where you've done so many interesting things. It's almost where I don't know where to begin, but I have to begin somewhere. So I'd like to begin by talking about sustainability. Why would you say there are so many economic models that have trouble accounting for externalities? Hopefully you know what externalities are. Why would you say that is?
Well, the power of the price system is that it's efficient. You can compare apples to oranges if apples and oranges both have a price attached to them. The challenge with sustainability is that many of the factors that determine whether economics are sustainable or not are not tradable goods, like clean air or clean water. And as a result, not having a price attached to them, the price system struggles to have rational and efficient allocation of those resources. Not everything can have a price tag attached to it. And some of the most important things in life are not valued in dollars and cents. But we do live in an economy of dollars and cents, which make decisions that govern our lives. It therefore becomes important that governments and the private sector find ways to come up with substitute ways of measuring how their activities affect the environment, their long-term sustainability, so that they don't end up, for example, cannibalizing our shared resources to make money today and find themselves unable to prosper or ourselves unable to live tomorrow. It's a challenge that all societies face. Some of them have responded better than others, but I will say that no one has come up with the perfect model.
Okay, so let's bring this home to Canada here. Given that the consumer carbon tax was scrapped almost a year and a half ago now, do you think Canadians genuinely care about the connection between sustainability and having a flourishing economy?
Oh, absolutely. But there's no denying that if you are struggling or worried about meeting your basic needs today, you can't afford to think about tomorrow. If you are afraid that you can't feed and house your family in the near term, then I can understand why people will think, we'll let the world burn in the long term. I think we all understand that ultimately the only way to create an economy that produces a decent standard of living today and tomorrow and for future generations is to have one that is built on environmental sustainability. We only have one planet. We only have one atmosphere. If we use it up today, then there's nothing that we can do tomorrow. But governments have not been very good at meshing the long term with the short term. They've not been very good at making the case to Canadians or in other societies that it is in their long-term interest to be able to make certain sacrifices today. And candidly, it's unfair to ask people to sacrifice today when they find themselves in desperate straits. These are, in some ways, the worst time to be having these conversations, when people have immediate pressing needs. And the best time to make good public policy is when things are going well, not when things are hard. Unfortunately, human nature is such that a lot of political actors only think about these things when times are hard, which is the wrong time to do so. Having said all this, most of Nature Canada's polling does show that, at least in principle, the vast majority of Canadians say that they are willing to make sacrifices today if it will provide their children with a better standard of living. I think that when people shy away from that, it's not because they don't understand it. it's because they feel some skepticism that their sacrifices today will have that benefit for tomorrow. So it's up to public policy makers not only to explain the case in theory, but to say practically and really, how will these sacrifices help your children and your grandchildren?
Yeah, so I can't help but think about the parallels, which are really clear to me about what financial advisors do. They're always telling their clients to take a long-term view, and they're always doing it for the benefit of yourself when you retire or for your children or your grandchildren. What role, if any, do you see financial advisors playing in getting people to turn the corner and to take a long-term view with regard to the planet and sustainability and flourishing, because it is, as you say, in everyone's interest to do so?
I think for each of us, if we're planning for our finances for the future, we should be thinking about the long term, not just what's making sense today, what's making money today, but what will bring stable revenues in return over the next 10, 20, 30 years, over the next generation. And that is absolutely tied to investing in activities that mitigate climate change or adapt to climate change. The hard reality is that climate change is already here. It's not a theoretical construct that will happen at some point in the distant future. We see climate change all around us with things like the wildfires sweeping across Canada's forests today. So the choices for us are not whether to stop climate change or not. It's how to deal with climate change and whether we mitigate the worst effects. And that is not just good for the environment, it's good business. People who invest today in activities that will pay a dividend tomorrow, because the world will be suffering from greater climate change tomorrow, are likely to prosper. People who make an investment today that will help to mitigate climate change, well, those kinds of returns on investment depend significantly on whether governments create financial incentives for people to do so. But what I would say to anyone who's thinking about his or her retirement or leaving something to his or her children or grandchildren, you can't just think about what's in the headlines. You have to think about what the world is going to be like over the course of the next generation. And it's impossible to have rational conversations about that without thinking about the impacts of businesses on the environment. I'll give one example. So Harvard University, which has an absolutely enormous endowment, has been spending a great deal of that money buying up aquifers across the United States. That is, buying up vineyards and land in the United States that sits on areas that have ready access to underground water and to groundwater. They're doing that not because they're environmentalists, but because they realize and they understand that in a generation's time, that water will become geometrically more valuable than it is today. They're thinking about the intersection between the environment and their own prosperity. That's something we should all be doing.
Great example. I'm wondering if you can even think of another one, helping people put an emphasis on stability and resilience as they plan for the future. Are there ways that we can game the system to honorably, but out of brazen self-interest, make more money, have a more stable retirement, a more resilient portfolio as a result of looking ahead and seeing things that are reasonably foreseeable and doing what we can, like Harvard is doing in terms of buying the land that's near aquifers?
Absolutely. I mean, there is no sustainable future for us that isn't based on enlightened self-interest. If you ask people to try to do what's in the best interest of society based on a sense of charity and philanthropy, some people will do so. Most cannot afford to do so. And so the challenge for all public policy making and all personal decision making is to make good decisions that that allow you to do good, but also to do well out of. And some of the areas that I think will become increasingly important in our economy are renewable energy sources, not only because people are turning away from fossil fuels as the effects of climate change reveal themselves, but also because, as we're seeing in the Iran-US conflict, a lot of those fossil fuels come from areas of the world that are locked in conflict. Those conflicts will become worse as climate change bites. And that means that our standard of living will become hostage to wars in far-off countries if we leave ourselves hostage to energy sources that are offshore. Renewable energy will always be a safer in the long term source of energy, and certainly something that gives us climate or energy autonomy and energy sovereignty. Right now, some of those are good investments, some of those are poor investments, but the sector as a whole will grow while fossil fuels are fated to decline. Another aspect is in what I would call nature-based climate solutions. So, for example, climate change is bringing about increasingly severe weather across our country. Sometimes our winters will be much colder, our summers will be much hotter, droughts will be drier, floods will be deeper. And in that context, the best way for cities to be able to protect themselves is by having environmental or green belts around themselves to absorb some of the energy that comes from those extreme weather events. If we do that, and if we make those investments, then our cities are likely to have an easier time, not an easy time, but an easier time weathering climate change. If we don't do that, there's a real risk that many Canadian cities will become effectively uninsurable as insurance companies decide, look, the claims that they will face for insuring houses, offices, and buildings simply cannot be justified.
Okay, so start and certainly worth hearing. I think I'd be remiss if I didn't take this opportunity to ask you a little bit about global affairs, given your past work with Munk. And I want to begin by asking you a little bit about things that some of which are very top of mind. You've already touched on the forest fires here in Canada and Spain and France, but the likelihood of climate refugees down the road in a world where there's a great deal of anti-immigrant sentiment. A lot of people seem to be, I would say, they're still sort of skirting over the issue. They're not really coming to terms with the fact that the climate crisis is upon us and that the effects are happening now. They are not coming down the road. They are only going to become worse, but they're already happening. Why would you say people are looking the other way and still sticking to their stubborn attitudes with regard to immigrants and denial of fires being caused by climate change and those sorts of things?
I think it's because these are hard questions and people would rather avoid them than engage with them. But the harder reality is that we have already entered an era of climate wars. We just don't realize them in Canada because they're happening in other countries. So, for example, I would point out that in Syria, where I suspect most of us are familiar with the Syrian civil war, it killed about 650,000 people and displaced nearly 7 million more. One of the reasons for that civil war, yes, it was in part because Syria had a highly authoritarian government and people were rebelling against it. But the other part was that Syria faced the worst drought in its history. There were massive crop failures that pushed the rural poor into urban centers, that created mass unemployment, collapsing infrastructure, and fueled uprisings against the government. Similarly, the war in Nigeria and in Darfur happened as a result of droughts and desertification, where people fleeing climate change collide with people in areas that are still productive. This is only going to happen more frequently. And there are many people who take a negative view of refugees. In part, it's because when you're feeling fearful and nervous, you guard jealously what you have for fear that someone else is going to come and take it away from you. But if we want to prevent or at least reduce the number of climate refugees coming to countries like Canada, then we need to act on climate change. If I cannot fault anyone whose choice is between starvation and migration to choose migration, and they're going to go anywhere that they can. I think what all of this really does reinforce is the extent to which all of us are connected economically, socially, and from a humanitarian perspective. Canada is an export-based economy. We know that our prosperity is based on our ability to export our goods and services to other markets. But we can't export our goods and services to buyers elsewhere if people elsewhere are impoverished and unable to afford those goods and services. Similarly, we cannot maintain the integrity of our borders if we find ourselves in a world where everyone is fleeing where they live in a blind panic. This really is one of those cases where doing the right thing for the world and doing the right things for our own prosperity do walk hand in hand. But it requires us to be willing to engage in enlightened self-interest with an emphasis on the enlightened part. There isn't a lot of that going around, but we need to summon the courage to have more of it.
All right. Well, you've already mentioned Syria and Darfur. I'd like to bring it to the point where people are maybe talking about things that are a little more familiar to people who are reading papers these days. The war in Ukraine started in 2022. You've had the war in Gaza, now Iran. There's strong evidence right now that Russia's been helping Iran. And it looks as though it's entirely possible that these isolated regional wars might actually morph into one big war. That, to me, is really frightening because of what you said in terms of geopolitical context, security of supply of traditional energy assets, and 20% of the world's oil going through the Strait of Hormuz. Do you think people are doing enough to try to put an end to those wars for the sake of global security? Because it seems to me, and I'm just one person, it seems to me that we are on the brink of what may very well be a severe and prolonged global recession as a direct result of one man making a decision to bomb Iran, thinking that he could engage in regime change. And when that failed, we're now in what Robert Pape calls an escalation trap, and the war just continues to mushroom and become more intractable, and therefore the consequences become greater. Do you see any way out? And if so, I'd be happy to hear what it would be.
The situation in the US-Iran war is a total mess. And let me be clear, the government of Iran is a brutal tyranny. No one should have any sympathy for the Iranian government. I think we should have a great deal of sympathy for the Iranian people, who are the primary victims of that government. The decision by the Trump administration to bomb Iran was not, in the first instance, necessarily a terrible idea if their bombing was surgical, if they were going after nuclear installations, and if they were leaving it at that. But Trump's decision to make this effectively a full-on invasion, not a ground invasion, there aren't American troops in Iran, but the extent of his intervention in Iran was a monumental miscalculation. When I asked my colleagues in the State Department, what was the strategy here? What were you hoping to get out of this invasion? To the extent that they're willing to answer the question, many of them use the phrase, this was a Piñata strategy. In other words, Trump was going to go into Iran and just whack it in the hopes that something valuable would fall out. That is a wildly irrational approach to global affairs. And of course, the difference between a piñata and a country is that a country can whack you back. And Iran has been whacking the United States back. Iran cannot win that war, but they can make that war irresistibly painful for the United States and the rest of the world. And that is what they are doing. For every dollar that the Iranians spend launching missiles at American assets, the United States is spending $20 trying to intercept them and shoot them down. The cost of the war for the US has been about $1 billion per day, more than $1 million per minute. And that is simply not sustainable. But in terms of the rest of the world, as you mentioned, the Strait of Hormuz is one of the world's choke points. It controls about 1/5 of the oil and gas, the seaborne oil and gas that's transported around the world. And though for a country like Canada, we purchase no oil that passes through the strait, the oil and gas that we consume is priced based on global supply and demand, not on local supply and demand. So that choking off of oil and gas through the Strait of Hormuz is causing a spiraling upwards of the cost of oil and gas in Canada. What is the solution to all this? It has to be a negotiated solution. The objective of trying to of ensuring that Iran does not develop a nuclear weapon is a legitimate objective. And unfortunately, it's an objective that has been set back by this war, because even the interim agreement that Trump signed and is now repudiated with the Iranians said nothing about what was going to happen to their Iran stockpile of enriched uranium, and explicitly said that for the foreseeable future, for the interim at least, Iran's nuclear program would carry on with the status quo. So for all the money, the loss of lives, most of whom are civilians, Trump has succeeded only in pushing the world towards a recession and further entrenching the Iranian regime. A negotiated settlement is in everyone's best interest. From the Iranian perspective, their economy is in tatters and they can't really survive economically a prolonged war. From the American perspective, Trump has to be worried about the coming midterm elections where he is likely to lose control of both the Senate and the House of Representatives if this war isn't resolved by then. But the weeks are counting down. And the truth is, there's a rational way to get out of this, but we are often governed by irrational people.
All right. Well, on that happy note, the podcast is called Make Better Wealth Decisions. And Akaash, you've got so much experience with regard to decision-making where stakes are high and where other people are informed and hopefully enlightened in their decision-making process. I'd like to leave you with a question, and that is, what advice would you give to my listeners to help them make better wealth decisions?
I think one of the most important things that we all can do with those sorts of decisions, and indeed decisions, big decisions in our lives, is to recognize that no one of us can possibly know everything. We were just talking about the Iran-US war. One of the reasons why the United States has gone down a dark path is that I believe Donald Trump thinks that he knows everything and surrounds himself with yes men and yes women. Whether you are making decisions that affect an entire country or decisions that affect your portfolio, one of the most important things you can do is find people whose judgment you have reason to trust, to take the advice of people who make it their business to make good choices and to be informed about what constitutes a good choice and to place themselves in their hands. You know, there's the Socratic idea that all wisdom begins with an admission of one's own ignorance. And we are all ignorant of certain areas in our lives. The decisions that affect your financial planning are too important and too big to be left to caprice. Find people you trust and people you have confidence in and give them a chance to justify that confidence.
The lovely way to end. That's so great. I want to thank you for your time today, Akaash. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you, and I want to wish you all the best down the road.
Thank you. It's lovely chatting with you too.
If you're worried about the current investment climate and your money, go to my website to book a call for personalized advice to assist you in feeling secure and protected about your retirement.